And over to yourself, Clive.
Well, good evening and welcome to our second seminar, challenge seminar we're calling these. And I'm delighted to invite everybody to feel they can participate. I'm going to say a few words about Bert, our presenter tonight, and in the vein that says this is about a group of people wanting to seeking to find out a bit more, but also trying to find ways to do some new thinking and new activity for SDGs. Bert I met, strangely enough, at Market Raising Golf Club. I was in the process of trying to create a safe zone on the driving range and struggling with a bit of gaffer tape to put down in a straight line. And I met Bert. And unbeknown to me, his talent was outstanding, extraordinary. And I thought, well, where's all this talent for white lines come from? And of course, you'll realise from his intro, he's an ex-policeman. So white lines come second nature to Bert. And his personality and friendship has been great over the last couple of years. Our conversation around the golf course, around this project we're involved in, has been great, as it has been with others I can see on the screen. So without much more ado, thank you, Bert, once again for your contribution to all of this, and we really look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Clive. Good evening, everybody. There are clearly a number of the trustees of the UNA here tonight who've got to know me a little bit, but just by means of introduction, I was a police officer with the Metropolitan Police for 30 years. I joined in 1986 and retired in 2016. The accent is a Belfast accent, but when I went home and told my mother that I wanted to become a police officer, she kindly inquired if I would like to go and do it somewhere else, as the troubles were at the height at the time, so I ended up in London. At the conclusion of my career down there, my wife and myself relocated to Lincolnshire. I lasted about 18 months in retirement before I felt the need to go back and do something again. And I found a job that I applied, was successful in getting with the Police and Crime Commissioners for the East Midlands region. And I worked for them as their regional collaboration manager. So those were the forces in Lincolnshire, Nottingham and Northamptonshire, Derbyshire and Leicestershire. And they're a mix of small and mid-sized forces, so increasingly they have to collaborate on things like murder investigations and road traffic and firearms. And I was the link between the 5 police and crime commissioners and the chief constables and the regional deputy chief constable in that role. And I did that for about 18 months before my wife pointed out to me that we had actually retired together. And it might be nice to rejoin her. And then in March last year, she went back to work for the National Health Service when COVID. So best laid plans and all of that. Through my career, I was very, very fortunate in some of the things that I did. And I was invited to do a piece of work in Jamaica, reviewing use of force policies by the Jamaican police. Back about the middle of my career, and that sparked my interest in sort of international comparisons in policing. And I was fortunate enough to do some work in the Middle East as well. And I was quite heavily involved in the security for the 2012 Olympics, which then led me to be able to work abroad again with other people planning for subsequent Olympics. Very, very lucky in some of the things I was allowed to do. When we started here with the UNA, I volunteered to take on responsibility for Goal 16, which is peace, security and sustainable organisations because of the interest I had in it. It's one that sits right down at the bottom of the list, almost as a little lone one. But I hope I'll point out tonight just how important it is to the actual delivery of the sustainable goals overall. So if you bear with me 1 second, I'll just bring the PowerPoint screen. Right, Clive, can you give me a nod if that's full screen and sharing? Lovely, thank you very much. So yeah, as I said, Goal 16, peace, justice and strong institutions. What I hope to do over about the next 25 to 30 minutes is just to bring us all to a sort of common baseline level of understanding, explain a little bit, try to answer the question, what is the goal? Why is this important? How is it being implemented around the world? I'll try and answer the question, why is it relevant here? And by here, I mean in Lincolnshire and the United Kingdom. I'll then talk a little bit about what the UK government's approach to the goal is and try and give a little assessment of how we're actually achieving against it here today. And then towards the end of it, just talk a little bit about what's the relevance to us as the Greater Lincolnshire United Nations Association and some of the next steps that we might want to consider. And then, as I said, we'll have the opportunity for some questions. So, what is the goal? As written, it covers three broad areas: to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide justice to all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And by all levels, really, they are talking local, regional, national, and international. Why has it been included? This is straight from the United Nations core documentation, so that people everywhere need to be free of fear from all forms of violence and feel safe as they go about their lives. I think that's an aspiration very few people would argue with. And secondly, that the UN recognise that conflict, insecurity and weak institutions remain threats to sustainable development. And I think this is very much, there are two sides to this coin. The 2030 agenda recognises that there can be no sustainable development without peace and security, and there can be no peace and security without sustainable development. The two things very much go hand in hand. A good sort of example of this is around climate change, where efforts to address it do need to consider the security of the people it's affecting, as well as the environment. What we're seeing is that as global temperatures rise, the potential for conflicts arising from drought and land degradation. And then we're also seeing that when people flee their homes in response to some of these problems, they then find themselves often competing with other populations for already scarce resources, which can exacerbate tensions between the different communities. The other things they're finding too is things like loss of arable land and livelihoods also leave young people more vulnerable to recruitment and radicalisation by armed groups and organised criminals around the world. In the last presentation, John Firth, who presented to us, almost in his very last slide, said that in order to get to net zero on carbon, we can only do this with advocacy and action from communities and governments taking radical action. And he emphasised the need for consensus politics at community, national and international levels. And without peace and security, those things are very, very difficult to achieve. A really good example of this at the minute, sorry, bear with me a second, is I don't know how many people listening tonight will have come across the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project, GERD, G-E-R-D as it's known. This is a hydroelectric power project that is currently under construction on the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, which is now creating some really significant regional tensions between Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt. 85% of the water feeding the Nile comes from the Ethiopian highlands, and the Ethiopian government have felt for a long time that they need to make great use of that natural resource that they have. And the idea that they come up with was the damming of the Nile and the creation of a hydroelectric project. Again, some very laudable aims there. Again, John Firth, when he was talking to us, was talking about the need to bypass carbon creating or carbon using energy generation, and hydro is a great way to get around this. But almost from the outset, this proposal has caused great consternation. Sudan were initially very, very against the project, but as they learned more about it, became more supportive. but Egypt were and remain highly concerned about the project and the effect it will have on the volume of water coming down the Nile, on which Egypt, as a nation of about 100 million people, is highly reliant. It will enable the Sudanese to some degree to control the water flow along the Nile, which helps with their irrigation projects. And they very much see the potential that if Ethiopia generates excess electricity from the project, they will be able to export it and thereby support other countries in the region. But as I say, with this underlying tension from Egypt. Lots and lots of people now starting to play around this particular project on the stage. The United States have been involved in trying to broker some agreements. Within the last couple of weeks, Saudi Arabia have stepped in and offered to take a part in negotiating to try and come up with a resolution. So we almost end up with the situation around this project where at the worst end of the scale, we could actually end up with a conflict between nations around access to water. Or from a slightly more positive point of view, these types of issues will occur going into the future. And there's actually a real opportunity for the three nations to set an example as to how you can resolve these types of issues through the good use of diplomacy. But I think it really does sit very, very well with the discussion around this particular goal. So, like any good goal, there has to be a set of targets that goes with it. And there are about 12 altogether. I don't propose to sit and go through them one by one with you here, but you'll see, words like significantly reducing all forms of violence and death rates everywhere. But just as a little illustration of just how wide this goal can actually go, on the next slide, at goal 9, I've just highlighted here, that the goal is by 2030 to provide legal identity for all, including birth registration. And this is actually a really significant issue because by implementing birth registration, you actually go around safeguarding children's rights and support their universal access to justice and social services as they grow up. And when the UN last did a survey based on 9 years of data between 2010 and 2019, they found that worldwide, the births of around 1 in 4 children are still not being registered. And in sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost half, 44% of children in that period did not actually have their births registered. Not just an issue for the third world, coming a little bit closer to home. If anyone has been looking at the issues around the Windrush issues in the United Kingdom, it's a great example again of the problems that can come from a lack of registration on a country's systems. When the original Windrush generation came to the UK, all Commonwealth people of the Commonwealth had residence rights. And when the Immigration Acts changed in the 70s, it changed the legal background, but many people never had the registration background. And that has subsequently caused some of them very many problems in later life. So, why is it important? We have seen 2 major wars fought on the continent of Europe in the last century. In the First World War, we saw some attacks on civilian populations. The appearance of the Zeppelins off the coast of England was the first strategic bombing campaign, I think, against the civilian population. And by the time we'd got to 1940 and 1941 into the Second World War, air capability had clearly progressed, and we saw a major bombing campaign against civilian populations with the Blitz. And then by the time we got to the end of the Second World War, with the development of nuclear weapons, we saw a weapon that is massively indiscriminate in terms of what it kills on the ground, targeted against 2 cities and civilian populations. So why is it important today? Well, actually, in 2019, the UN said that the numbers fleeing war and persecution had exceeded 79.5 million, which is the highest number that they've ever recorded. And as you can see on the slide there, every day, 100 civilians, including children, are being killed in armed conflicts. A second area, from 2015 to 19, 1,940 killings and 106 enforced disappearances of journalists and people involved in human rights defences and trade unionists around the world. Over half of those killings and disappearances occurred in Latin America and the Caribbean. And the third area, that I think highlights the importance of this is that trafficking of children is a global problem, often associated with sexual exploitation. And around the world, as you can see, almost 1/3 of detected trafficking victims are children. And unfortunately, one of the problems that manifests itself is sexual violence. Very hard to get comparable data around the world, but across the world, to the best of our knowledge from the data, at least 5% of women worldwide between the age of 18 and 29 have reported experiencing sexual violence in childhood. So, how's the goal being actioned around the world? I'll just talk through three areas here. United Nations peacekeeping, Interpol's global policing goals, and I'll talk a little bit about one of the lesser aspects, again, that people don't often talk about, which are some freedom of information laws and the importance of them. So, UN peacekeeping missions, probably one of the most recognisable things that the UN actually does around the world. I think the sky blue helmets are quite a recognised symbol of the UN. And they have carried out 71 peacekeeping missions since 1948. There are currently 12 live missions taking place on 3 continents. And as you can see on the slide there, approximately 94,500 people were deployed in those 12 missions as of December 2020. In terms of the cost of it, $6.58 billion is the approved budget for peacekeeping for this year. I saw a statistic elsewhere when I was doing the research for tonight. To put that in perspective, that is less than 1% of worldwide military spending for this year, even at that substantial amount of money. Today's peacekeeping operations really are multidimensional. Obviously, we see them in terms of maintaining peace and security in the countries they go into and protecting civilians. But actually, a major part of some peacekeeping missions is the disarmament, demobilization, and the reintegration of former combatants in the country. But there's also a role for the peacekeeping mission in facilitating the political process, organizing elections, and helping again promote human rights. And UN peacekeeping is guided by 3 basic principles. It must take place with the consent of the parties where the mission is taking place. Impartiality is clearly at the core of the mission, and a very strong push for non-use of force, except where it is clearly in self-defense or defense of the mandate. And again, just in terms of that, to put it in perspective, since peacekeeping missions started, just over 4,000 peacekeepers have lost their lives in support of the missions. And the 12 current ones have so far claimed the lives of almost 1,700 peacekeepers in delivering those mandates. As I say, we often think of it as a military function, but in fact, there's a significant role for policing in the peacekeeping missions. And the UN has been employing police officers on those missions since the 1960s when they were first deployed to the Congo. Worldwide, there are about 11,500 police officers currently authorized to do this. It's actually about 9,000 currently deployed on the missions. All the blue beret wearing members are all active duty members of their home country's police services who get seconded to the United Nations. And since 1990, 129 countries have seconded officers to the peacekeeping missions, an increasing number of which are female police officers. And there were approximately 1,200 deployed in December of this year. In terms of what the policing component of the peacekeeping missions does, in addition to a major role about helping facilitate secure elections, there is a real role about assisting on investigating incidents of sexual and gender-based violence in the countries, and also in starting to help host countries prevent and address problems coming from serious organised crime and violent extremism in the countries, and also increasing countries' capability to deal with things like environmental and wildlife crime. And a major role too for them in assisting with the reform and restructuring of the host state police forces. So sort of moving away from the United Nations, I'll just talk a little bit about Interpol, or to give it its proper name, it is the International Criminal Police Organization. Huge coverage now, 194 member countries across the world. In terms of how it's organised, there is a general secretariat that coordinates its day-to-day activities, run by a secretary general who is voted for and into post, and their headquarters based in Lyon in France. The way they work is that each country has a national central bureau, and that provides a link between the host country and the General Secretariat in Lyon. It normally sits in the government ministry responsible for internal affairs, which in our country is the Home Office. And our National Central Bureau actually sits within our National Crime Agency, the one the tabloids love to call Britain's FBI, which is it's a relatively recent organisation that has progressed over the years from regional crime squads and the likes. And our office is actually physically located in Manchester within the National Crime Agency set up there. There's a couple of fairly unique things about Interpol. They have actually been granted permanent observer status at the United Nations since 1996. And in 2004, they actually opened an office of the Special Representative for Interpol at UN headquarters in New York. And they've now got a subsidiary office in Vienna as well. So as an organisation, it continues to develop. So in terms of what does it actually do that could be in support of this goal 16, well, that's a lovely little graphic they have there that I lifted from their website. Counter-terrorism, organised and emerging crime, and cybercrime are their three main areas of expertise and support to countries at the minute. But they do lots and lots of things. They have separate, at the minute, about 18 separate databases that are searchable worldwide, with the increasing ability for host countries to put fugitives on there to be searched for worldwide when they come into contact with other forces. A massive issue on at the minute, cybercrime is really growing at an exponential rate, and Interpol have a major role now in helping to develop worldwide capacity to deal with that. So that's what they do. The other thing that's worthy of mention is they have actually developed 7 global policing goals. Number 1, countering the threat of terrorism. They talk about border integrity and vulnerable communities. But right over on the right-hand side of the slide, supporting environmental security and sustainability is one of their global policing goals. And the little graphic at the bottom, for those who recognize it, it's the wheel diagram that shows the 17 sustainable development goals. And what they've attempted to illustrate is how each of the 7 goals can support the delivery. And as you can see, around environmental security and sustainability, it is hitting many, many of the goals. Where I think this is particularly interesting is if you spoke to UK policing, they would tell you that they're doing many of these things. Clearly, terrorism and border security is one of their big issues. Curbing illicit markets in drugs and finance and and animal products and the likes. But despite an extensive literature search, and I've got a reasonable idea to know where to go to look, I cannot find these global policing plans written in any of the strategic plans for the Home Office, the National Crime Agency, any of our police and crime commissioners, and our local police forces. So there's a little bit of a gap there at the minute. I'll talk about later on. And then, why is it relevant here? Well, we don't have the issues that there are in many parts of the world. We don't have any current needs for UN peacekeeping missions at the minute. But I do think that actually Goal 16 is very relevant to us here in the United Kingdom. You know, I think we clearly have a moral obligation as a stable Western democracy to be supporting and assisting countries in the world that can benefit from some of our experience and expertise. But I will try and demonstrate that I actually do think that there are some things that are relevant here. And I'll talk a little bit about access to justice, attacks on journalists, and that freedom of information goal as a way of illustrating this. So the first one I'll talk to a little bit just is access to justice. The goals say that access to justice for all should ensure a fair trial within a reasonably short period of time. That's the aspiration for a well-run fair justice system. Last week, the BBC reported that the current backlog of cases in the Crown Court in the United Kingdom has risen to 56,000 cases since the start of the pandemic. Now, this isn't just a COVID issue. When we actually went into the pandemic in March last year, the backlog was sitting at 40,000 cases. And for those who know the UK justice system, the Crown Court generally hears the most serious of the cases, those that involve a jury to hear them. So why does it matter? Well, first off, from a victim's perspective, many victims of crime will report that the court case and seeing their offender being brought to justice is a major part of the closure process for them along the way. And in the BBC report last week, they actually reported on a female victim of a serious sexual offence who had actually postponed her access to counselling and support until the other side of the trial to avoid compromising the trial process in any way. And based on the numbers that I've just given to you of 56,000, we're now actually scheduling cases for 2023 for the Crown Court. And the effect that will particularly have on victims, I think, might be significant. But from the flip side too, you know, looking at the accused's perspective, worldwide, around 31% of all prisoners in detention have not actually been sentenced for a crime. And that level hasn't declined since 2005. Now, within the United Kingdom, the number of prisoners in our prisons as of December who have not been to trial is sitting at around 15,000 at the minute. 15%, which equates to around 12,500 people sitting in the prison on remand, waiting for their trial to happen. And, you know, as you might expect, at the most serious end of the spectrum for things like murder and manslaughter, I think most people would expect that those people would be remanded to custody pending trial. But almost a quarter of the remand population at the minute is actually waiting crime for drugs offences, some of which, you know, are from possession with intent to supply up to the most serious supply. And about 1,200 of those people are actually charged with theft-related offences. You know, and the potential to sit on remand for 2 to 2.5 years pending trial is probably not the ideal place to be. And just in terms of our prison population, in the UK at the minute, we're sitting at just under 80,000 in UK prisons. Over many years, we've seen the evidence of prisoners at 2 and 3 to a cell, which again, worldwide, across the world, more than a quarter of people who are in prisons that are actually at a prison population of in excess of 150% of what the prisons were actually designed for. Another little one that many people may not be aware of is a process called the single justice procedure. Obviously, with things now like automatic cameras for traffic enforcement, the potential to put cases into the criminal justice system is huge. And the single justice procedure was brought in as a means of removing about 800,000 cases a year from the magistrates' court system. And how it actually works in practice is that a single magistrate sitting on their own with a legal advisor hears a particular case. The defendants in the case are notified of the intention to deal with it that way by letter and invited to submit a guilty plea or a not guilty plea as they see fit. It is worth emphasising that if they insist on having a court appearance, that is still an option that is open to them. But they have actually found that more than 70% of people notified of the process haven't put a plea in. And it has started to raise concerns, particularly during the pandemic, when mail has been held up in the system, as how many people have actually been tried for something and have very little awareness that they've actually been through a trial process that can result in a criminal conviction for them. And only last week, the chair of the Magistrates Association called for ministers to consider how the process could be opened up to public scrutiny and how openness and transparency could be improved in that process. The second area, just to show that everything may not be rosy in the United Kingdom either, is attacks on journalists and restrictions on press freedom. Again, as I said earlier, there are journalists being killed around the world. 2019 was actually the lowest total for some years in terms of actual killings of journalists, but the problems continue. Just last Friday, the Times reported on the jailing of 2 journalists in Belarus who were jailed for 2 years for covering demonstrations against President Lukashenko. And what they actually did was they ran a live stream of the demonstration over their internet platform. And they were prosecuted for leading group actions that grossly violate public order, was the Belarusian authorities' view on it. And the prosecutors argued that covering the rally encouraged others to join it. And for that, they were sentenced to 2 years in prison. But back to the United Kingdom, I wonder how many of us have been aware that the UK government has actually been formally warned for threatening press freedom. What has actually happened is that the Council of Europe issued a media freedom alert after Ministry of Defence press officers refused to deal with an organisation called Declassified UK, which is a website that specialises on foreign and defence policy stories. And the Council of Europe actually classified this as a state category restriction because the officials behind it were civil servants and in the employ of the state. And unfortunately for us in the UK, it wasn't actually the first time, because in May last year too, we were also served with a state-focused media freedom alert from the Council of Europe when open democracy journalists were banned from asking questions at the government's coronavirus press conferences. So, issues that do need to be considered and kept in mind in the UK. And on the 4th of June last year, just after some Black Lives Matter protests in London, the National Union of Journalists actually the following day issued a statement condemning what they saw as escalating attacks on reporters and photographers. And the NUJ asked for an end to the hostility and harassment that they felt was undermining press freedom. The NUJ reported that at the protest the previous day, a number of journalists and photographers had actually been attacked by protesters at the protest. And Some of you may remember one of those attacks was actually on an Australian television news reporter, which was actually captured live as she was broadcasting. But equally, to show the flip side of it, in the same condemnation, the NUJ actually also indicated that the behaviour of some police officers on duty at the protest included pushing, shoving and verbal harassment of journalists, and they raised their concerns directly with the National Police Chiefs Council the following day. What they're tending to find too now is increasing harassment of journalists, and particularly women journalists online. If anyone's a user of Twitter, if you ever have a look at what's trending, if you look for #Naga, #Louise, and some of the stuff that's put in there when those particular journalists are online isn't particularly pleasant stuff. And the last one, again, just talking about freedom of information. We do have a Freedom of Information Act in this country. I've sat on the far side of the desk dealing with some of those requests as they come in. Actually, a really, really important facility for people to hold government and institutions to account, and one that's perhaps not as widely used as people may wish. So, just moving on, what's the UK government's approach to this this particular goal? One of the things that's worth mentioning here is our government's approach to this is very much shaped by our constitutional arrangements. Since 1999, we've obviously had a good degree of devolution in this country, but there are a number of issues that are reserved for the UK government to lead on behalf of all the nations within the United Kingdom. And the 7 of them are listed here on the slide in front of you, and particularly for goal 16 here, foreign policy and international development are 2 of those that are still reserved to the UK government.
Hi, Bert, did you want a 15-minute warning?
Yes, please. Is that where we are, Clive? We're at 15. Thank you. So, in terms of how the UK government has actually gone about approaching the goal, as I say, some of these comments are actually applicable to all the goals and not just goal 16. The little graphic on the right-hand side is the front cover of Agenda 2030, Delivering the Global Goals. And this is how the government decided it would actually go about implementing it. And the approach in the UK was to ask each of our government departments to include their approach to the goals in their single departmental plans that they were required to write. Again, just in the process of research, it's been amazing to see just what a black hole 2020 has actually been in terms of development of some of these. Most of the single departmental plan updates I can find are all dating back to 2018 and 2019. So it'll be really interesting to see once normal business gets picked up after COVID, what updates we see. This is the type of thing that you see in those departmental plans. This is a lift from the Department for International Development's single departmental plan from 2019. Those words that you see written all over the goal and the aims around instability, insecurity and conflict, crime and corruption, etc., etc. And the Home Office, when I checked their departmental plan, I was pleased to see that they do actually have SDG 16 embedded into their single departmental plan. So, in terms of that, how are we doing against it? Well, the UK government have undertaken a voluntary national review. And what that process is at the time of agreeing to go down the road of these Sustainable Development Goals, each government that signed up undertook to do a voluntary national review at some point in the run-up to 2030, and we did our first one back in 2019. At the time, responsibility for doing that within the UK lay with DFID. And I'll talk a little bit about DFID in the next couple of minutes, because it has subsequently been part of a government reorganisation. But they coordinated the review, worked with the Cabinet Office and the Office for National Statistics to come up with it. The quote I've put in there by Rory Stewart is from the introduction to it. And as you can see, it's broadly positive that the Minister, proud of what we've achieved and humbled by what we haven't, and has taught us many things along the way. But just to try and break that down a little bit for you, how are we actually doing against it? So in terms of crime, the report is saying that there's been a significant reduction in crime compared to when we started in 2009. In terms of homicide, as you can see, in March 2018, 726, which was an increase of 42% from March 15. Again, to put that in context, the United Kingdom is an incredibly safe country compared to many across the world. That breaks down to a homicide rate per 100,000 of, I think it's about 1.2 for the UK, and worldwide it's sitting somewhere between 5 and 6 at the minute. So in overall terms, we are still an incredibly safe country. Modern slavery, at that time, we had about 300 prosecutions across the country. In terms of prison population, as you can see there, it was about 11.2% on remand. It's gone up slightly. And the review talked a lot about our accountable institutions, and within the report, it talked about some of the legislation that had been brought into the United Kingdom to try and keep our institutions accountable. Things like the Bribery Act that came in within the last few years, that put lots and lots of new legislation in place to try and prevent bribery becoming an issue in the United Kingdom. So that's the government's perspective on it. You probably won't be surprised that other people have offered a contrary view to this. One organisation that has had a look at the Voluntary National Review is the UK Stakeholders for Sustainable Development. And this is a quote from their report. Again, I have to say, it was reasonably positive. As they said, an enormous amount to celebrate. Some people might accuse them of being critical, but in their view, all they were trying to do was to strive for the best. But what they found was, of 143 targets that they considered relevant to the domestic goals, we were performing well on about a quarter of them. They felt that there were still some gaps in policy or inadequate performance on 57% of them, and a small number where they could actually find little to no policy in place to address the target, or where performance wasn't well defined. So all of this, what's the relevance to us? I think we're in an incredibly fortunate position in this country, but I think we just need to be aware of some of this. So one way in which it's relevant to us is by us exercising our right to hold our elected officials to account. In May this year, possibly sliding depending on COVID again, will be the next round of Police and Crime Commissioner elections. These will be the third since the PCCs were brought into being. I think a very legitimate question for PCC candidates as we go into those elections is, how do they see the Sustainable Development Goals impacting on their strategies, the police forces going forward? Exercise our rights to using our Freedom of Information Act's abilities, and perhaps we shouldn't be afraid to share some of what we find on there with our elected representatives. And the last one, promoting inclusion and respect towards people from different groups. I think all things we can do against our own background here that are actually relevant to the goal.
But I'm just conscious that if we could perhaps include that in answer to a question, can we just take any questions now? Because it's about 25 past.
Yeah, absolutely, Clive. As I say, next steps, I can pick up the demand for one in relation to that, Clive. So if you'd like to move us on.
Okay, just to say I've got some questions here that I think people might be interested in looking at. I think Jane was going to ask a question.
Yes, I was. You mentioned very much in passing COVID a few minutes ago, and I wondered if you had a view about the challenges that the post-COVID world will throw up for this particular SDG.
Yeah, just a sort of very quick answer to that, Jane. I'll go back to my comfort zone of some of my knowledge on policing. Interpol actually issued an alert in December to law enforcement across the world, warning them to prepare for organised crime networks targeting COVID-19 vaccines, both physically in terms of trying to get their hands on them to use for their own means, and in terms of attacking the program online. They've already identified around the world lots and lots of false websites, particularly purporting to be online pharmacies that would give people access. And some of those websites are absolutely laden with malware and the likes that enable organised crime to get into it. So, you know, COVID and the vaccine, a very, very early area that organised crime has identified potentials in.
Okay.
Thank you.
Interesting that in terms of impact at local levels for that. Secondly, David, something about EU, was it?
Yeah, sure. Yes, but in terms of the UK's withdrawal from the EU, what effect could that have on delivery of Sustainable Goal 16?
Okay, yeah, just on that one, David, there was a Munich security conference held last week that was addressed by both President Biden and our own Prime Minister. Our own Prime Minister actually did the closing address at it. And I think people were very interested to see where the UK would position itself in relation to that. And the point that the Prime Minister made was he thinks that the UK still has a role to play worldwide in terms of our convening ability to pull people together to discuss some of these issues. And he apparently expressed his view that that's what the United Kingdom should seek to become. Interestingly, he did talk quite a bit, though, about Germany, France, and the UK continuing to build on the transatlantic alliance with America. Two of the particular issues he talked about where he felt the UK had more latitude post-EU was on sanctions policy, but actually many people have said that sanctions are most effective when they're brought to bear by large economic blocs as opposed to individual countries.
Sure.
So that was just a little taste of sort of some of the views of the PM last week.
Thanks.
Okay, and Clifford, were you asked something about the FID, was it?
Yes. I mean, after nearly a quarter of a century, the government has decided to merge the Department for International Development, which is effectively the Overseas Development Agency, back into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Yeah. And I just wondered what Bert's view was of how this might affect the delivery of the SDG he's been so carefully describing to us.
Yeah, I think, Cliff, what I've managed to pick up on it so far is, I think critics of the move, and it is quite interesting that the decision to move DFID into the FCO was actually criticised by David Cameron, a former Prime Minister who didn't agree with that particular move. And I may be misquoting Theresa May, but I've got a feeling that she added her voice to that as well. But I think one of the major concerns they have is they feel that DFID has had a particular strength in taking the long view and recognizing that some of their initiatives are long-term and require a sustained input. The view being that the FCO in the past have demonstrated a slightly more short-termist approach to some of its interventions and places, and a criticism that's been levelled at the MOD as well. So I think that's where it might play out, is will DFID's recognised long-term approach fall foul with a short-term approach in the FCO?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Just Bert, so on the last slide, you talk about De Montfort University and their work. Could you say something about that?
Yeah. That's a real feather in the cap for the university. There are a small number of academic institutions around the world that have been identified to be lead institutions for some of these sustainable development goals, and De Montfort has been allocated that for SDG 16 and have started to do quite a lot of work in the university. They have actually got an academic partnership with the East Midlands Policing Group, and where there's some good linkages for us in that. The Deputy Chief Constable, Chris Howard, who set up that academic collaboration with De Montfort, is actually the new Chief Constable of Lincolnshire, who came into post only a few weeks ago. So I'm hoping that Chris will bring to us here in Lincolnshire those links back to the academic world. And in his role as the Deputy Chief Constable, Chris was the lead for serious and organised crime. But yeah, so we've got a real hub down there at De Montfort, but perhaps as UNAGL is worth us looking to link in with as well.
Okay. Are there anybody else that has a question they'd like to raise with Bert? Okay. One thing I keep putting our thoughts and minds to is new thinking and new actions. Obviously, Bert's outlined a significant range of things there, from Interpol and mention of Ethiopia and Sudan and conflict worldwide. But if we come down to our own county and look at the issues that are faced within our settings here and SDG 16, are there things that, it's open to all here, are there things that we could be doing as individuals or in our sphere of influence to raise issues around what is SDG 16?
I think maybe, Clive, this is one of the challenges on it, is when you do that first look at what the goal is there for, it can be very, very easy to look at it and go, it's not an issue for us in the UK. It's an issue for other places in the world where there is conflict on the ground. But actually, there is so much more to the goal than that when you start to peel away the different layers of it.
Can I just make an observation? When at the beginning of your presentation, Bert, you were talking about how young people were at risk of things like radicalisation and organised crime, and I'm thinking things like county lines and that sort of thing. And actually, I think there is quite a significant link into schools there and education, because it's an increasing challenge for school leaders to, in certain areas, to be able to help support and to a certain extent protect the young people in their care. And I can see that there's quite a distinct link there that could be developed at local levels, particularly where there were vulnerable groups of children that were known about because of the way that the schools monitor. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
Sally?
I think Jane makes a very valid point, and I think, speaking to my 28-year-old daughter before I came on this Zoom, I sent her the information that Clive sent through, and she said, I don't understand what it's about. I can't understand why it's relevant to us or what I'm doing. And she's a real, she's set up zero waste websites, led a zero waste life. She's a sustainable person in her own right, but she couldn't understand what it was talking about. And I must admit, I did struggle a bit, having not been involved with councils, or, you know, I'm just a businesswoman. I don't. So it's probably trying to make it relevant to people so that they can understand what the whole project is really trying to do.
I think for us, Sally, the feeling I got from it is, going right back to the start, this underpins you and your community's ability to deliver these goals. And we're so incredibly fortunate in the United Kingdom. Yeah, we don't have to worry about the bombs raining down on us. We don't have to worry about the landmines that have been seeded around our villages and communities. But equally in this country, you know, we shouldn't be complacent about the ability to lose some of the very fortunate things that we do have, the right to freedom of information, the journalism that we have in that. And I think for us, an awful lot of it is just maintaining the very fortunate aspects that we do have. In other places, there's a huge amount to be worked on just to deliver the real basics in those countries to enable sustainable development to happen.
And one point I would make is, I'll be amazed if everyone in this room hasn't already seen modern slavery occurring on the doorstep.
Yeah.
I mean, you only have to go to these car washers where the gangers are there managing the teams, and those guys cannot be paid a proper wage for what they're doing. It's just impossible.
Yeah. I noticed last week that the Police and Crime Commissioner, Mark Jones, has actually launched a whole series of online training sessions for people to recognise the signs of modern slavery in the community. It is absolutely here amongst us. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, I'm very conscious of our time, and if people have to go, if people want to continue this dialogue for a few more minutes, I'm happy to do that. If people have to go, I know Liz mentioned it earlier, she's not going to see the soaps. If you disappear, Liz, that's okay. Delighted to see you. But I was just going to say that in terms of the United Nations, there's a big thing around education and the rights respecting school. And I suppose for me, from my own background, is that if youngsters aren't brought up with the fact that they have rights and accountabilities in their decisions and actions towards one another, then they grow up in the sense of saying, I can do what I like until I face a brick wall. And so the bit about agency and the bit about how you develop that through dialogues in schools is quite tricky. I don't know how you find that in terms of the COVID agenda that we have at the moment, that it is a community response in the end, that we're all in this together, we're not safe till we're all safe. And yet there's a whole thing around that. And if you translate that around the world, that was the same issue around AIDS going the years back. It's the same issue around Ebola. And unless you have dedicated, strong institutions and strong buy-in to those institutions by the population, then the notion of justice and peace evaporates. I don't know how you feel about that.
You should take that as broad agreement, Clive.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I just find it so difficult. Okay, shall we draw this to a close? And many thanks for all joining. Is Janice there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Bert. I very much enjoyed your presentation. It was extremely informative and interesting. And I think you've aptly highlighted all the hard work that goes on behind the scenes with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which most of the general public are not aware of. I think, as Clive has just alluded to it a little bit, and which is a conversation that we've all perhaps had in the past, and agree that learning starts in the home. I was brought up in a small village, and I can vividly remember my mum and dad saying to me, "The police are your friends, don't forget that." And that's something I've never forgotten. So we now live in a troubled world, but I particularly, for one, have much appreciated the work that the police have done in our lifetime to make this country more safe and secure. And I think I could speak for everybody here connected tonight in saying a big thank you for your presentation. It was excellent. Thank you.
Thanks,
thank you. Yeah, thank you, Bert. Brilliant. Just to say, I'm just called upon to talk about what we're doing next. Our next seminar is next month, and please we'll send information out on our normal channels for that. And many thanks for joining us. There is a project we're involved with called My World, Our World, and that's about trying to get intergenerational dialogues. If you go on the website and have a look at that, I actually sent a link to that to all of our political leaders in Greater Lincolnshire recently, inviting them to have a go. And that is to try and get a conversation with yourselves, 3 generations around a goal that you might think you could do something about individually and together. My World, Our World 2030. And if we can run it for 10 years, it'd be an interesting development of what small things you could do this year that could be bigger next year. And if you start when you're 10, in 2030 you're 20. And as I said to the guy I'm working with, in 2030 I'm 77. So it'd be an interesting dialogue over the 10 years if you keep that connection going. Hopefully we can build that into a bigger thing. There's a longitudinal research agenda that Lincoln University might be interested in to do with us. So thank you once again to everybody, and especially to Bert, and thank you for making your time available for tonight to be part of this. If you think these are good ideas, let us know. If you want to feedback how we might improve this, please do so. If you want to say, well, if I were going to ask someone to join, they would perhaps like this. That's the kind of feedback we'd like, because we think this is a wonderful opportunity for sharing some good information and promoting what we're thinking about, which is new thinking and new actions to promote the SDGs. Thank you once again to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clive.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everyone.
Thank you.